I grew up in a house where love was never absent, it was just never meant for me. From the outside, we looked like the perfect family. My parents were respected in the neighborhood, our lawn was always trimmed, and our holiday photos showed 4 smiling faces in matching outfits. But behind closed doors, there were 2 versions of our home, the one where my younger sister, Ayesha, was treated like a princess, and the one where I existed quietly in the background, expected to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention fell my way. Ayesha was only 2 years younger than me, but she might as well have been born into a different family. When she cried, my mother rushed to her side as if the world was ending. When I cried, I was told to stop being dramatic. If Ayesha brought home a B on a test, my parents would take her out for ice cream to cheer her up. When I brought home straight A's, my father would glance at the report card and nod, as if I'd done nothing more than what was required to justify my existence. "You're the older one," my mother would always say whenever I tried to speak up. "You should understand." Understand what? That love had conditions. That being responsible meant being invisible. I learned early on not to ask for things. The first time I did, I was 8. Our school had organized a trip to a science museum, and I came home clutching the permission slip like it was a golden ticket. I waited until dinner, until both my parents were seated, and then I slid the paper toward them with trembling hands. "Can I go?" I asked softly. My father skimmed the paper, then placed it on the table. "It costs money," he said flatly. We'll see." He interrupted. A week later, I watched as my mother handed Ayesha a brand new pink bicycle with streamers on the handles. She squealed and threw her arms around them while I stood in the doorway, the unsigned permission slip still folded in my pocket. I never brought it up again. As we grew older, the gap between us only widened. Ayesha got new clothes every season while I wore her hand, me downs even though I was taller than her. She had a room decorated with fairy lights and posters, while mine was plain, its walls bare except for a single crack that stretched from the ceiling to the corner of my window. When relatives visited, they were always told to look at Ayesha's dance performances or her drawings pinned proudly on the fridge. My certificate stayed hidden in a folder under my bed. It wasn't that my parents were cruel in an obvious way. They fed me, clothed me, and made sure I went to school. But there was a constant, silent message in everything they did: you matter less. I tried to earn their approval in every way I could think of. I helped my mother in the kitchen, cleaned the house without being asked, and stayed up late helping Ayesha with her homework, even when she treated me like her personal servant. "Fix this," she'd say, shoving her notebook toward me. "I don't get it." Sometimes she didn't even bother to say please. And still, I helped her, hoping that maybe one day she'd tell our parents how much I did for her, that maybe they'd finally look at me with pride. They never did. One evening, when I was 12, I gathered the courage to ask my father why he never came to my school events. I had just won first place in a district-wide essay competition, and the teacher had asked parents to attend the ceremony. I had scanned the crowd again and again, hoping to catch a glimpse of his familiar figure. He never showed. When I asked him about it later, he barely looked up from the television. "You're a smart girl," he said. "You don't need us there. Your sister has her dance recital next week, and she gets nervous on stage." It was said so casually, as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world, as if my achievements were so expected they didn't deserve celebration, while Ayesha's nerves deserved everyone's attention. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering what it would feel like to be someone worth showing up for. By the time I reached my teenage years, I had stopped trying to compete for their love. Instead, I focused on surviving the house without drawing attention to myself. I spent most of my time in my room, studying or reading borrowed books from the library. The silence there felt safer than the living room, where Ayesha's laughter filled the air and my parents' affection revolved around her like planets around the sun. Relatives noticed the difference, of course. At family gatherings, aunts would pinch Ayesha's cheeks and tell her how beautiful she was, how she was clearly her mother's favorite. They would turn to me and say, "And you're the quiet one, aren't you?" I would smile politely, the way I had taught myself to do, and nod. Once, my grandmother pulled me aside in the kitchen while everyone else was busy outside. She handed me a plate of sweets and looked at me with a softness I rarely saw in anyone's eyes. "You remind me of your grandfather," she said. "Always working hard, never complaining." I didn't know whether to feel proud or sad. Hard work was praised, but it never seemed to bring me any closer to the kind of love Ayesha received so effortlessly. The older we got, the more entitled she became. She would take my things without asking, borrow my clothes and return them stained, or blame me when something in the house broke. And every time, my parents believed her version of the story. "She's younger," my mother would say, shaking her head at me. "Why do you always make things difficult for her?" I started to question my own reality. Maybe I was difficult. Maybe I expected too much. Maybe I really was just the extra child, the one who existed because families were supposed to have more than one. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when the truth became impossible to ignore. Like the day my father announced that they were saving money to send Ayesha to a private academy because she had potential. I sat at the same table, eating the same dinner, yet no one asked about my plans for the future. It was as if my life was already decided. I would manage on my own. That realization settled in my chest like a stone. I stopped imagining a day when my parents would suddenly wake up and realize how they had treated me. I stopped hoping for fairness. Hope, I learned, only made the disappointment sharper. Instead, I began to build a quiet promise to myself. If I was going to be alone in that house, then I would learn how to stand alone in the world. I studied harder, saved every bit of pocket money I could, and planned a future that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. I was still a child, but somewhere deep inside me, something had already hardened. Not into bitterness, at least not yet, but into a kind of silent resilience. I watched, I listened, and I remembered everything. Because even then, without fully understanding why, I had the feeling that one day, I would leave that house with nothing but my own strength, and that the people who had once made me feel invisible would finally be forced to see me. By the time I turned 18, I had already accepted that nothing in our house was ever going to be fair. Still, there was a small part of me that clung to the hope that adulthood might change things. I thought that once I was older, once my parents saw how serious I was about my future, they might finally treat me like someone worth investing in. I had spent my final years of school working harder than I ever had before, while Ayesha was busy going to parties and posting pictures online in expensive outfits my parents happily paid for. I stayed up late under the dim light of my desk lamp, studying until my eyes burned. I earned one of the highest scores in my class and received acceptance letters from 2 good universities. One of them even offered me a partial scholarship. The day the letter arrived, I held it in my hands for a long time before opening it, afraid that if I blinked, it would disappear. When I finally read the words congratulating me on my admission, my chest filled with a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. That evening, I placed the letter carefully on the dining table in front of my parents. "I got in," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "If I take the scholarship, the tuition will be much lower. I just need help with the rest." My father adjusted his glasses and read the letter in silence. My mother glanced at it briefly before returning her attention to Ayesha, who was scrolling through her phone and complaining about how slow the internet was. "How much is the rest?" my father asked finally. I told him the amount. It was a lot, but not impossible. They had spent more than that on Ayesha's birthday party the year before. He leaned back in his chair and sighed. "That's still expensive. It's an investment," I said quietly. "I can work part-time too. I can't do it alone." For a moment, no one spoke. I waited, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. Then my mother cleared her throat. "We'll think about it," she said in the same tone she had used years ago when I asked to go on that school trip. I knew what that meant. Weeks passed, and they never brought it up again. Whenever I tried to ask, my father would say he was busy or that we would discuss it later. Later never came. Then one night, everything became painfully clear. I walked into the living room and found my parents and Ayesha gathered around the coffee table, excitedly looking at brochures and fabric samples. My mother was holding up a piece of lace against Ayesha's shoulder, while my father studied a catalog of banquet halls. "What's going on?" I asked, standing awkwardly near the doorway. Ayesha looked up, her eyes shining. "I'm getting engaged," she announced, as if she were sharing the best news in the world. The room spun for a second. She was only 19. She hadn't finished any kind of higher education, and she still depended on my parents for everything. "That's fast," I managed to say. "It's a good match," my mother said quickly. "His family is well off, and they want the wedding soon." I watched as they discussed guest lists, decorations, and catering menace. The numbers they were throwing around were far higher than the amount I had asked for my education. And they weren't hesitating for a second. A cold, hollow feeling spread through me. "So there's money for a wedding," I said slowly, "but not for my university?" The room went silent. Ayesha frowned at me as if I had ruined her celebration. My father's expression hardened. "This is different," he said sharply. "Your sister is starting a family. That's important. And my future isn't?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. My mother's face tightened. "Why do you always have to make everything about yourself? Can't you just be happy for her?" I stared at them, waiting for someone to laugh, to say they were joking. No one did. That night, I cried for the first time in years, not quietly into my pillow like I used to, but in deep, shaking sobs that made my chest ache. It wasn't just about the money. It was the realization that I had been right all along. I was never going to be a priority. A few days later, my father called me into the living room. He looked uncomfortable, as if he'd rather be anywhere else. "We've decided something," he said, avoiding my eyes. "You're 18 now. It's time you start being independent." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "What do you mean?" "You can stay here for a few more months," my mother added, "but after that, you'll need to find your own place. With the wedding and all the expenses, we can't keep supporting you." Supporting me. As if they had ever truly supported me in the first place. I nodded slowly, because I didn't trust myself to speak. If I opened my mouth, I knew all the anger and hurt I had buried for years would spill out, and I was too exhausted to fight anymore. The months leading up to Ayesha's wedding were a blur of noise and chaos. The house was constantly filled with relatives, tailors, decorators, and wedding planners. I became invisible again, moving through the crowded rooms like a ghost. No one asked about my plans or where I would go once I left. It was as if my departure was just another item on their checklist. On the day of the wedding, I helped Ayesha get ready. I zipped up her heavy embroidered dress and adjusted her jewelry while she stared at herself in the mirror, smiling. "You're lucky, you know," she said suddenly. "You don't have to deal with all this pressure. You can just do whatever you want." I met her eyes in the reflection. She truly believed that. In her mind, my lack of support, my lack of resources, my lack of options, it all looked like freedom. I almost laughed. After the ceremony, as guests showered her with blessings, and my parents beamed with pride, I slipped away to my room. I looked around at the plain walls, the cracked ceiling, and the single suitcase lying open on my bed. Everything I owned fit inside it. On my last night in that house, I walked through each room quietly. The living room where I had watched my parents celebrate Ayesha's achievements. The kitchen where I had helped my mother cook while she complained about how difficult I was. The hallway where my childhood photos hung, fewer and smaller than Ayesha's. In the morning, I carried my suitcase to the front door. My parents were busy discussing some post-wedding arrangements, barely noticing me. "I'm leaving," I said. My mother looked up briefly. "Take care of yourself." My father nodded without meeting my eyes. Ayesha wasn't even there. She was already on her honeymoon. That was it. No hugs, no advice, no tears. I stepped outside into the bright sunlight, the weight of the suitcase pulling at my arm. For a moment, I stood there, staring at the house where I had spent 18 years trying to earn a place in my own family. Then I turned and walked away, with nothing in my pockets, nowhere certain to go, and a quiet, burning promise in my chest that one day I would build a life so strong, that I would never have to beg anyone to choose me again. The first night I spent on my own was in a cramped, dimly lit room above a grocery store on the edge of the city. The landlord called it a studio apartment, but it was barely large enough to fit a narrow bed, a small table, and a hot plate balanced precariously near the window. The walls were thin enough that I could hear the neighbors arguing, and the hum of the refrigerators downstairs never truly stopped, even in the middle of the night. I sat on the bed with my suitcase still unopened beside me and stared at the peeling paint on the wall. For the first time in my life, there was no one to tell me what to do, no one to compare me to my sister, no one to make me feel small. The silence should have felt freeing. Instead, it felt terrifying. I had no safety net, no family I could call if something went wrong. If I failed, there would be no one to catch me. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise and began the routine that would define the next few years of my life. I worked wherever I could find work. First at the grocery store downstairs, stacking shelves and ringing up customers, then at a small cafe 2 blocks away where I served tea and wiped down sticky tables. In the evenings, I attended classes at a local college that had accepted me after I explained my situation and showed them my grades. It wasn't the university of my dreams, but it was something, and I refused to let the opportunity slip away. My days blurred into one another. I would leave the apartment in the morning, while the sky was still gray, return late at night with aching feet and ink-stained fingers, and fall asleep with textbooks open on my chest. There were weeks when I survived on instant noodles and discounted bread because I needed to save every rupee for tuition and rent. There were moments when I almost gave up, like the day I received my first electricity bill and realized I had miscalculated my expenses. I sat at the tiny table, staring at the numbers, feeling the familiar sting of panic rising in my throat. Back home, problems like this would have been handled by my parents, even if they complained about it. Now, there was no one but me. I picked up extra shifts at the cafe and started tutoring 2 neighborhood kids in the evenings for a small fee. It meant sleeping even less, but the relief of being able to pay my bills on time was worth the exhaustion. Slowly, painfully, I began to adjust. I learned how to cook simple meals that didn't cost much, how to fix a leaking tap with the help of online videos, and how to stretch a small amount of money across an entire month. Every problem I solved on my own felt like a small victory, proof that I wasn't as helpless as my parents had always made me feel. College became my refuge. In the classroom, no one knew about my family or the way I had left home with nothing. They only saw a quiet girl who always submitted her assignments on time and asked thoughtful questions during lectures. For the first time, I wasn't being compared to Ayesha. I was simply being judged on my own merit. That was how I met Sana. She sat next to me during a statistics class, her notebook filled with colorful highlighter marks and messy doodles in the margins. One day, she leaned over and whispered, "You explain things better than the professor. Can you help me study for the test?" I hesitated. I wasn't used to people asking me for help in a way that felt respectful rather than demanding. But I agreed, and we started meeting in the library after classes. She brought homemade snacks, and we would spread our books across the table, quizzing each other and laughing quietly when we got things wrong. Over time, Sana became the first real friend I had ever had. She didn't know the full story of my family at first, but she noticed the way I avoided going home for holidays, and how I always flinched when my phone rang, and showed my parents' number, which they only used occasionally to ask about official documents or signatures they needed from me. "You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to," she said once, her voice gentle. "But just so you know, you don't look like someone who deserves to be alone all the time." Her words stayed with me long after she said them. With her encouragement, I applied for internships during my second year. I was rejected more times than I could count. Each rejection email felt like a reminder that my background, my lack of connections, and my mediocre college name were obstacles I would always have to fight harder to overcome. But I kept trying. Eventually, a small marketing firm offered me an unpaid internship. Most people in my position would have turned it down because they couldn't afford to work for free. I almost did too. But something inside me whispered that this could be the door I had been waiting for. So I rearranged my schedule, took even more shifts at the cafe on weekends, and spent my weekdays in a cramped office, learning everything I could about social media campaigns, client meetings, and branding strategies. I stayed late, volunteered for extra tasks, and asked questions until my supervisors started to rely on me. After 3 months, they offered me a time-paid position. It wasn't much, but it was the first time someone had looked at my work and decided it was worth paying for. That moment changed something inside me. I graduated with decent grades and a growing list of small professional achievements. While other graduates celebrated with their families, I celebrated by buying myself a slice of cake from a bakery and sitting alone in the park, watching the sunset. It wasn't the celebration I had once imagined, but it was honest. I had earned every step of this journey on my own. The years that followed were no longer about survival alone, they were about growth. I moved from the tiny room above the grocery store to a slightly larger apartment with actual sunlight streaming through the windows. I left the cafe job and focused entirely on my work in marketing, eventually switching companies for better opportunities and higher pay. I learned how to dress professionally, how to speak confidently in meetings, and how to negotiate my salary without apologizing for asking what I deserved. Each time I succeeded, I felt as though I was rewriting the narrative my parents had created for me, the one where I was the less capable, less deserving daughter. Santa remained by my side through it all, cheering for every promotion and comforting me when work became overwhelming. With her and a small circle of colleagues who respected me, I finally experienced what a healthy support system felt like. No one compared me to anyone else. No one told me I should settle for less because that was all I was worth. By the time I turned 26, I had saved enough money and gained enough experience to take a risk that would have terrified the girl I once was. I left my stable job and started my own small digital marketing consultancy. The first few months were nerve-wracking. I lay awake at night worrying about clients, deadlines, and whether I had made a huge mistake. But I remembered all the nights I had survived on instant noodles and determination. I reminded myself that I had built everything in my life from nothing before. I could do it again. Slowly, the business began to grow. One satisfied client led to another. My reputation spread through word of mouth and online reviews. Within 2 years, I had more work than I could handle alone and hired my first employee, a shy graduate who reminded me of myself at 18. The day I signed the lease for a small office space, with my company's name printed on the door, I stood there for a long time, running my fingers over the letters. It felt surreal. The girl who had once been told she wasn't worth investing in now owned something that existed entirely because of her effort. My relationship with my family during those years was almost non-existent. They called occasionally, usually around holidays, their voices polite but distant. They never asked about my work in detail, and I never volunteered information. It was easier that way, keeping that part of my life separate from the people who had once dismissed my dreams as unnecessary. There were still moments when old wounds ached. When I saw daughters laughing with their mothers at shopping malls or fathers proudly attending their children's graduations. But those moments no longer broke me. They were just quiet reminders of what I had survived. I had built a life that was stable, independent, and mine. I paid my own bills, made my own decisions, and surrounded myself with people who chose me without being forced to. For years, I had dreamed of proving something to my parents, of one day showing them what I had accomplished despite their lack of support. But as my life grew fuller and more secure, that desire slowly faded. I realized that I didn't need their approval anymore. Their opinions no longer held the power to define my worth. I thought that chapter of my life was closed for good. I was wrong. The evening they came back into my life began like any other. I had stayed late at the office reviewing a campaign proposal, the glow of my laptop casting long shadows across the empty room. My small consultancy had grown into a steady, respected business, and deadlines had become a normal part of my routine. By the time I finally locked up and drove home, the streets were already quiet. the city settling into the soft hum of night. My apartment was on the third floor of a modest but clean building. It wasn't luxurious, but it was comfortable, filled with things I had chosen myself. Warm, colored curtains, a bookshelf packed with novels and old textbooks, a framed certificate from my first major client hanging on the wall. Every item inside that space was a reminder that I had built this life from nothing. I had just changed into comfortable clothes and was heating leftovers in the kitchen when the doorbell rang. I frowned. It was nearly 9 at night, and I wasn't expecting anyone. Santa usually texted before visiting, and my employees never came to my home. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, assuming it was someone at the wrong door. But the bell rang again, longer this time, followed by a hesitant knock. A strange unease settled in my stomach as I walked toward the door. I checked through the peephole and felt the world tilt beneath my feet. My parents stood on the other side. They looked older than I remembered. My father's hair, once thick and black, was now mostly gray. His shoulders slightly hunched. My mother's face was lined with wrinkles that hadn't been there when I left home. They were dressed neatly, but their clothes looked worn, as if they had been used for years without replacement. For several seconds, I just stood there, frozen, my hand hovering over the lock. 1,000 memories crashed into me at once: the dining table where they had dismissed my dreams, the front door I had walked through with my suitcase, the silence that had followed me for years afterward. The bell rang again. I unlocked the door and opened it slowly, keeping the chain on. Yes. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. My mother's eyes widened when she saw me. "You look well," she said awkwardly. My father cleared his throat. "Can we come in? We need to talk." The word need echoed in my mind. They had never needed me before. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to close the door, to protect the life I had built from the chaos they had once brought into it. But curiosity, and something deeper, something tied to years of unresolved pain, made me unhook the chain and step aside. They walked in cautiously, their eyes scanning the apartment. I could see the surprise on their faces as they took in the tidy living room, the modern furniture, the framed awards on the wall. "You live here?" My mother asked softly, as if she couldn't quite believe it. "Yes," I replied, crossing my arms. "What do you want?" They exchanged a glance, silently pushing the responsibility onto each other. Finally, my father sat down on the edge of the sofa, his hands clasped tightly together. "We wouldn't have come if it wasn't important," he began. I remained standing. "Then you should probably get to the point." He took a deep breath. "It's about AITA." Hearing her name after so many years felt like reopening an old wound. I waited, saying nothing. "You know, we helped her and her husband start a business after the wedding," my mother said, wringing her hands. "We gave them the house as well. Everything was going well at first." I almost laughed at the familiar words. Everything was going well. That had always been their way of describing Ayesha's life, even when cracks were starting to show. "What happened?" I asked, though I already had a sinking feeling I knew the answer. "They made some bad decisions," my father admitted, his voice heavy with shame. "Her husband invested in the wrong people. The business failed. They took loans to try to recover, but the debts kept growing." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "The bank took the house last year. They've been staying in a rented place, but they can't keep up with the payments anymore. And now the creditors are coming after us too because we signed as guarantors." The room fell silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on my wall. "So," I said slowly, "you're in debt." My father nodded. "And you came here because—" He looked up at me then, his eyes pleading in a way I had never seen before. "Because you're the only one who can help us." The words hit me harder than any insult ever had. The only one who can help us. For years, I had been the only one they didn't help. I sank into a chair across from them, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to shout at them, to list every moment they had chosen my sister over me, every opportunity they had denied me while handing her everything she wanted. Another part of me felt an unexpected, unwelcome ache at seeing them so small and defeated. "Where is she now?" I asked. "At home," my mother whispered. "She was too ashamed to come." Ashamed. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. Ayesha had never been ashamed when she took my things, when she blamed me for her mistakes, when she accepted everything my parents handed her without a second thought. "And what exactly are you asking from me?" I continued. My father hesitated before answering. "We need financial help to pay off the immediate debts. Just enough to stop the legal action. After that, we'll figure something out." Just enough. The same phrase echoed in my mind from years ago, when I had asked for help with my tuition and been told there wasn't enough to spare. I stood up and walked to the window, needing the distance. The city lights flickered below, cars moving in steady lines along the road. Somewhere out there were people living ordinary lives, untouched by the complicated knot of emotions tightening in my chest. "You told me to be independent," I said without turning around. "You told me you couldn't support me because you had other priorities." No one replied. "I left this family with nothing," I continued, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "I worked multiple jobs, skipped meals, and studied until I thought I would collapse. Not once did any of you ask if I needed help." My mother began to cry quietly. "We were wrong," she said between sobs. "We thought Ayesha needed us more. We thought you were strong enough to manage on your own." I turned to face them, anger finally breaking through the calm surface I had maintained for years. "So you rewarded her for being irresponsible and punished me for being responsible." My father flinched as if I had struck him. "We know that now," he said hoarsely. "And we regret it every day." Regret. Another word that came far too late. They sat there in my living room. The same parents who had once made me feel invisible, now looking at me like I was their last hope. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that it almost felt unreal. "What about Ayesha's husband?" I asked. "What is he doing to fix this?" "He's trying," my father said weakly. "But no one wants to work with him anymore." Of course they didn't. Reputation mattered in business. I knew that better than anyone. I studied their faces, searching for the familiar signs of favoritism, of excuses, of any hint that they still believed Ayesha deserved more than I did. But all I saw was exhaustion, fear, and a quiet desperation. For years, I had imagined this moment, my family coming back to me, forced to acknowledge my worth. In my fantasies, I had been triumphant, delivering cold, cutting words before slamming the door in their faces. But reality was messier than that. They weren't villains in a story, they were aging, flawed people who had made terrible choices and were now facing the consequences. "So what happens?" I asked slowly. "If I say no?" My father's shoulders sagged. "Then we'll lose everything," he said simply. "And we'll have no one else to turn to." The room seemed to shrink around us, heavy with years of unspoken pain and sudden, unexpected vulnerability. I realized then that whatever decision I made in that moment would shape not only their future, but mine as well. I didn't answer them that night. After my father's words hung in the air, "Then we'll lose everything," I told them I needed time to think. I walked them to the door, and for a brief second, my mother looked at me as if she wanted to hug me. She didn't. She simply murmured a quiet thank you and followed my father into the hallway. When the door closed, the silence in my apartment felt heavier than it ever had before. I leaned against it, staring at the floor, my mind replaying the conversation over and over. The younger version of me, the girl who had left home with a single suitcase, would have given anything to hear them admit they were wrong. And now that I finally had that moment, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing at a crossroads with no path that led to peace. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw different versions of the future one, where I refused to help and they lost their home, their dignity, and perhaps their health. Another where I gave them everything they asked for, and found myself, once again, being taken for granted. Slipping back into the role of the invisible daughter who existed only to clean up Ayesha's mistakes. The next morning, I called Sana and asked if she could meet me for coffee. She arrived within 20 minutes, her expression already concerned from the urgency in my voice. As we sat in a quiet corner of the cafe, I told her everything about my parents' visit, the debts, and the way they had looked at me as if I were their last lifeline. She listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around her cup. When I finally finished, she let out a slow breath, "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted. Part of me wants to slam the door in their faces the way they did to me. But another part of me, I don't want to become someone who can watch her parents suffer and do nothing. Sana nodded thoughtfully. Helping them doesn't have to mean forgetting what they did. And refusing to help doesn't automatically make you strong. The real question is what decision will let you sleep at night 5 years from now. Her words stayed with me long after we left the cafe. That evening, I sat at my dining table with a notepad, listing the facts the way I would for a business decision. How much debt they had. How much I could afford to lose without risking my company or my own stability. What kind of boundaries would be necessary to make sure history didn't repeat itself. For the first time, I wasn't reacting like a hurt child. I was thinking like the businesswoman I had become. 2 days later, I called my parents and asked them to come back to my apartment. When they arrived, they looked even more anxious than before, as if they had spent the entire time expecting me to reject them. I didn't offer them tea or small talk. I handed my father a printed document and sat down across from them. "I'm willing to help," I said calmly, "but only under certain conditions." They stared at me, stunned. "This is not a gift," I continued. "It's a structured financial agreement. I will pay off the urgent debts directly to the creditors so the legal action stops. In return, you and Ayesha will sign a contract acknowledging this as a loan. You'll repay it over time in manageable installments. And there are other conditions." My father's hands trembled slightly as he held the paper. My mother looked at me as if she didn't recognize the person sitting in front of her. "What conditions?" she whispered. "You will not take out any more loans for Ayesha or her husband," I said firmly. "If they want to start another business, they do it with their own money. I will not be your safety net for their decisions. And from now on, if you want to be part of my life, you treat me with the same respect you always gave her." The room was silent for a long time. Finally, my father nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "We have no right to ask for help without accepting your terms." My mother wiped her eyes. "You've become very strong," she murmured. "We didn't see it before." I almost replied that I had always been strong. They just hadn't bothered to look, but I let the comment pass. Some truths were too heavy to keep dragging into every conversation. They signed the agreement that evening. A few days later, I transferred the necessary funds directly to the creditors, watching my savings drop by a painful amount. It wasn't enough to ruin me, but it was enough to remind me how fragile stability could be. In the weeks that followed, my parents called more often. Not to ask for more money, but to update me on the situation. They sounded different, more careful with their words, as if they were afraid that one wrong sentence might make me disappear from their lives again. Eventually, I agreed to meet Ayesha. We chose a neutral place, a quiet restaurant in the middle of the city. When she walked in, I barely recognized her. The confident, spoiled girl I had grown up with was gone, replaced by a tired woman with dark circles under her eyes and worry etched into her expression. She sat across from me, twisting her fingers together. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "I didn't realize how much they were giving me until it was too late. I thought it was normal. I thought I deserved it." I studied her face, searching for signs of insincerity. All I saw was shame and regret. "I helped you because they asked," I replied evenly. "Not because you apologized." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I know. But I still needed to say it." That conversation didn't magically fix our relationship. Years of resentment and imbalance couldn't disappear in a single afternoon. But it was a beginning, a fragile, uncertain step towards something resembling honesty. Over time, my parents started visiting occasionally, always calling beforehand and always treating my home with a respect they had never shown me before. They complimented my work, asked about my business, and listened when I spoke instead of interrupting or dismissing me. It was strange, watching them try to rebuild a relationship they had once taken for granted. Sometimes I caught glimpses of the family we might have been if they had treated us equally from the start, and those moments brought a bittersweet ache that never fully went away. Ayesha and her husband found modest jobs and began making small repayments according to the agreement. The amounts were tiny compared to what they owed, but the consistency mattered more than the money. It showed effort, responsibility, things she had never been forced to learn before. I didn't help them beyond what we had agreed. When my mother hinted once that Ayesha was thinking about starting another small business, I reminded her gently but firmly of the conditions we had signed. To my surprise, she didn't argue. She simply nodded, as if she finally understood that the days of blind favoritism were over. Months later, I was sitting alone in my apartment, reviewing quarterly reports, when I realized something had changed inside me. The anger that had once lived in my chest, like a constant flame, had cooled into something quieter, an awareness of what had happened, but no longer a pain that controlled my every reaction. Helping my family hadn't erased the past, and it hadn't magically turned us into a perfect, loving unit. What it had done was give me control over the narrative. I hadn't helped them because they deserved it. I had helped them because I chose to, on my terms, with my boundaries firmly in place. For the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to their decisions or begging for their approval. I was the one setting the rules, deciding how much of myself I was willing to give, and where I drew the line. One evening, as I stood on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker to life, my phone buzzed with a message from my father. "Thank you for not giving up on us." I stared at the words for a long moment before locking my phone and slipping it back into my pocket. I hadn't done it for them. I had done it for the girl who had once walked away from her childhood home with nothing but a suitcase and a stubborn belief that she deserved better. Helping them without losing myself proved that she had been right all along. I hadn't just survived the life they gave me. I had risen above it, built something stronger, and finally, after years of being overlooked, become the one person in the family who truly understood the value of responsibility, respect, and quiet, hard-earned strength.